Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about DNSless connections and how they work with an Access front-end and SQL Server back-end application. As an example, I've got my training and personnel system up here, and as you can see over here on the left, I have tons and tons of connected data objects that I'm using in this application. It's a fairly large application. And what I have here, I only have one local table, and all this table is, just created it, it's just a table of the connections that I am connecting to. So all of these objects exist on the SQL Server. And what I want to do is I want to create a DNSless connection from the Access front end to SQL Server. Why are there so many of these things? Well, it's not just going to be the tables. As you can see, all these are tables that start with TBL. There is a lot of them. This is a fairly large application. But you'll get into temp tables and also all these things that start with VW. Yes, those are views. So the way that you maintain a decent performance with an Access front end and a SQL Server back end is you treat those views as sort of data objects the same way you would treat tables. You connect to them from Access to SQL Server so that the view or query, I guess if you want to stick to that, the query or view is firing off on the SQL Server. If you don't do that, if you have your queries on the front end, I do have a couple of queries here, but trust me, I don't use any of those. They're just ones I was playing around with. I don't use any local queries in any of my reports or on my forms, especially ones that are the real workhouse forms and reports, because there's a real performance hit. What Access does is it pulls data in all the tables that might be in that query. It pulls all that data forward and then executes the query on the front end. Now the front end might be some terrible computer, and so it can be really, really slow. Not only are you transferring an enormous number of records, way more records than you need to, over the network, you're also relying on Access on a local computer to do all that heavy lifting. Much, much better that you create these connections from the Access front end to SQL Server and let SQL Server do all the heavy lifting. It is designed to do that. The SQL engine is much more efficient. It's bound to have tons more memory and more processor power, and just let SQL Server do its job. Access is definitely designed with the idea of having an Access front end, Access back end in mind. And Access back ends are kind of dumb. So we understand and we support Access in doing things the way that they do them. But if you have a SQL Server backend, you need to take advantage of it. So anyway, okay, so I have a table of all the data objects, and the way that I got that table very quickly, I'm looking at over 200 connections here, and I don't want to sit there and type them all out into a database, of course. What I can do is I can, from the SQL front end, run a query called, this one I call it just query connect SQL data objects. And what it is it's a query of the metadata from the Access side. So the table that I'm querying, I'll show you, is MS sys objects. That's a local table that's kind of, it's a system table, so you won't see it in your tables over here. But it is available along with some other tables if you want to do those sort of metadata queries. And all this is, you can see over here, it says type 4. Type 4 in MSSys data objects tables, those are the linked tables. So what I'm going to do to show you what I came up with here is I'm going to scroll down all of these links. I'm going to hit the shift button, and I am going to delete them all. No longer there. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, the scenario is I have taken this database and I am trying to give it to somebody else, like say another agency somewhere, and they're going to set up their SQL instance. They're going to put the database on their SQL instance, I should say, and get it all set up, and then they're going to need to reconnect this Access front-end application to those SQL tables using their server name, exactly, or their instance name. And so all I've done is I would be giving them this front end with no connections, and then when they go to open it up, they would get this form. And all this is doing is it's using that same MSys objects data objects table. It's querying it when the form first opens up. It's saying, hey, are there any link tables here? And if there aren't any, it goes, well, that's not okay. So simple instructions. Step one, make sure that the database has been created on the SQL Server backend and that you have permissions to access the database. Of course, the first thing that this thing is going to do when you hit the button is it's going to make sure that that SQL instance exists and that you can connect to it. And if it has any sort of a problem, it's just going to yell at you. Okay, so my SQL instance name is DCHS SQL. It could be whatever it is. If you had a named instance, it would be the name of the server / name of the instance. But in this case, I'm using the default instance because I don't have any named instances on my server. And I am going to click Connect to SQL Server Tables. And what it's doing is it's going through that table. I'll show you the code in a second. It's going through, it's creating kind of a cursor, and it's going through all the records in that table. And it's creating a DNSless connection for each one of those data objects that I have in that local table. Now I set it up to, so it would kind of write things one at a time as it went through, but it doesn't really work like that. But I could come in and I'll say, I'll go all the way down, look at all these wonderful things. It did not have any problems. If it did have any problem, it would just stop and you could just run it over again until fix whatever problem you might have had, and it would run it over again, and that would be fine. So, okay, then it's step 4. After connecting to SQL Server, you can just go to the form, just close it, and boom, there's all my connections. All my buttons have come back. These buttons, what it is I have, depending on who you are, I have on the Access front end, it asks it gets your Windows authentication login name, and I have a table in SQL Server that sort of parcels out rights or access to different parts of the database depending on who you are. So that's a sort of a first step, or a second step, I guess, really, of security after just the simple Windows authentication ability to connect to the database. So I can allow you to connect to the database, but then maybe I only give you access to certain parts of the application, so you only see certain things or are only able to do certain things. Okay, so enough about that. Over here on the left, you'll see that all those connections are back. And if I were to open one of them up, this is actually a demo database, so I took everything out. So here's a table. This is the person table. I'll even open it up for you. The edit existing employee records table. There's only me in this database. Normally we have about 700 people, but in this demo version of the database, there's just me. So it worked out fine, and as you can see, it was fairly painless. Okay, thank you.